All right, then. So if you're one of those people who really wants to get to grips with a complicated subject, but without having to wade through mountains and mountains of information,
Yeah.
well, you've come to the right place. And today we are going deep into a really quite fascinating bit of space history. The Soviet Union's ZOND 5 mission.
Ah, yes. September 1968.
1968.
This mission was, quite significant.
Yeah.
Not just another launch.
Right.
It was actually the very first time that any spacecraft had traveled all the way to the moon, looped all the way around it, and come back to Earth in one piece.
And survived.
And more than that,
Yeah.
this was the first lunar mission to carry living beings.
Ooh.
Now, you can imagine in the context of the Cold War space race, it was a
Yeah.
very big deal.
Huge.
Yeah,
Huge.
right.
Yeah. So I've got my notes here from March the 15th of this year.
Right.
And a whole lot of detailed bits and pieces that we've kind of pulled out of various sources. So we're going to try and unpack the whole ZOND 5 story for you. We'll look at when things happen.
Oh, timeline.
A timeline, exactly. And what they were hoping to achieve, what its aims were, what were the problems they ran into along the way. And of course, we'll dig into the detail of all those living things that were on board.
The biological payload.
The biological payload, exactly. Plus some of the, shall we say, the unexpected stories that came out of it all.
Indeed. It's a very interesting mission in that respect.
It is, yeah.
Right.
So where do we start?
Well, I think it's worth just setting the scene a little bit.
Okay.
Talking about the ZOND program in general.
Yeah, okay.
So this was essentially the Soviet Union's version of a crew lunar flyby spacecraft. It was based on what they called the Soyuz Heaven KL-1.
Okay.
And these were big spacecraft, big powerful engines to send them on their way.
Right.
They used a Proton K carrier rocket for that, which had a Block D upper stage.
Okay.
So that gave it the oomph to get all the way to the moon.
So it's kind of a multi-stage thing.
It was, yes.
Right.
A series of powerful engines firing one after the other.
Right. But it's worth saying, isn't it, that the Soviets hadn't really had it all their own way up to this point.
Oh, absolutely. The path to ZOND 5, it wasn't exactly a smooth one.
Yeah.
They'd had a number of setbacks with earlier missions.
Yeah. There was ZOND 4, which I guess you could say was sort of a partial success.
A qualified success, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. And then things kind of went downhill from there, didn't they? I mean, there was ZOND 1968A, which never even made it off the ground.
An aborted launch, yes.
Yeah. And then 1968B, which was, that was a complete disaster.
A launch pad explosion, which sadly resulted in fatalities.
Yeah. So, given all of that, you can understand why they decided to err on the side of caution with ZOND 5. Because originally that was going to have a crew, wasn't it?
It was, that's right.
They were actually planning on sending cosmonauts around the moon. But all those previous failures, I suppose it must have spooked them a bit, didn't it?
You can see their thinking. After those two big failures, particularly ZOND 1968B, there was a real fear of more bad publicity, of negative propaganda if a crewed mission went wrong.
Right.
Imagine the impact if cosmonauts had been lost in those accidents.
Yeah. So safer to stick with robots for the time being. Okay, so let's talk about the launch itself. That happened on September 14th, 1968, was it?
That's right.
At 9:20 in the evening, UTC, from Baikonur, Site 81. It must have been quite a sight to see.
Oh, I'm sure it was spectacular. The launch sequence was quite something in itself.
Okay.
The third stage of the rocket, that cut out when they reached an altitude of 160 kilometers. Then they had this period, a ballistic coast they call it, where they were just basically flying without any power for 251 seconds. And then, boom, the Block D upper stage ignited, and that burned for 108 seconds to get ZOND 5 into a parking orbit around the Earth.
So that was about 191 by 219 kilometers, wasn't it?
That's right.
And then 56 minutes later, the Block D fires again to put it on course for the moon. So quite a complicated procedure.
It was, and in fact, the Soviets, they didn't actually announce the launch publicly until after that final translunar injection burn was successful.
So they didn't want to tempt fate, did they? But it wasn't all plain sailing from there, was it?
Not quite.
Almost immediately after launch, they ran into trouble with the spacecraft's attitude. Basically, it wasn't pointing in the right direction.
Yeah, that's right. And the reason, it turned out that one of the star trackers, a crucial bit of equipment for navigation, had become contaminated.
Really? How did that happen?
Well, it seems it was a problem with outgassing, some kind of gas being released from the equipment, probably because of the heat.
Oh, I see.
And this, of course, delayed their ability to get the spacecraft properly orientated.
Right, so who did they get around that then?
They were resourceful, these Soviet engineers.
Yeah.
They managed to do an attitude correction when they were, something like 325,000 kilometers away from Earth.
Wow.
And they did it using the sun and the Earth as reference points instead of relying on the faulty star tracker.
That's pretty impressive.
It is, isn't it? So despite that initial hiccup, they finally managed to get ZOND 5 to the moon.
On the 18th of September, right?
Yes.
And how close did it actually get?
The closest approach was about 1,950 kilometers. It didn't go into orbit around the moon. It just flew past, took some pictures, gathered some data, and then continued on its journey back to Earth.
So it sounds like the technical gremlins weren't quite done with them at that point.
Not quite.
What happened next?
Well, on the way back, a second star tracker failed.
Oh, dear.
And as if that wasn't enough, the guided re-entry system, well, that got switched off accidentally.
Oh, no. They must be having kittens back in mission control.
One can only imagine.
So what did they do?
Well, the Soviets had taken the precaution of deploying 8 ships in the Indian Ocean, just in case the spacecraft didn't return to Soviet territory as planned.
Right. Wise move, as it turned out.
Indeed. Because on the 21st of September, when it came time for re-entry, well, it didn't go quite according to plan. Instead of landing safely in Kazakhstan, as was intended, ZOND 5 ended up splashing down in the Indian Ocean.
Oh, dear.
Somewhere around 32 degrees, 38 minutes south, and 65 degrees, 33 minutes east.
And how far was that from the nearest Soviet ship?
A good 105 kilometers.
Yeah.
And it landed at night, which didn't help.
No. So I imagine it must have taken a while to recover it.
It did. But eventually, 2 Soviet vessels, the Borvichy and the Vasily Golovnin, managed to find it and bring it back.
And the Americans were watching all this, weren't they?
They were. U.S. intelligence had a ship, the USS McMorris, in the area monitoring events.
I bet they were. So how long was the entire mission in the end?
6 days, 18 hours, and 24 minutes.
And the Americans reckoned that off-target landing added about 10 hours to the recovery time?
That's right.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about the really groundbreaking aspect of all this, the biological payload. You know, this was the first time that any Earth creatures had been sent anywhere near the moon. It's quite something when you think about it.
It really is. And it was quite an eclectic mix of passengers they sent up there. 2 Russian tortoises.
Right.
They weighed between 340 and 400 grams each before the flight. They were given the rather impersonal designations of number 22 and number 37.
Numbers 22 and 37. I like that. Very scientific.
Very. They also sent up a bunch of fruit fly eggs and a whole load of plant material.
Such as?
Well, cells from wheat, barley, peas, pine trees, carrots, tomatoes. Oh, and a wildflower called Tradescantia pallidosa.
Tradescantia pallidosa. Bit of a mouthful?
It is, rather.
Right. What else?
3 strains of chlorella algae. And even a strain of lysogenic bacteria.
Wow, so a real Noah's Ark of the microscopic world.
You could say that.
So what was the thinking behind sending all this lot up there?
Well, the primary aim was to study the effects of cosmic radiation.
Ah, right, of course.
You know, to see what impact being exposed to space radiation would have on living organisms.
And I suppose the idea was to get some insights into what might happen to humans in a similar situation.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that these organisms weren't exactly stand-ins for humans.
No, I suppose not.
The Soviets deliberately chose things like extremophiles, life forms that are naturally very resistant to radiation. So the results they got from those experiments, they might not be directly applicable to human space travel.
Right, of course. But they did also have a mannequin on board, didn't they?
They did, in the pilot's seat, in fact. And that mannequin was equipped with radiation sensors, so they were still gathering data relevant to humans, even if they weren't sending humans up there themselves.
Makes sense. So those poor tortoises, they were basically locked up 12 days before the launch and denied food and water.
Yes, and so was a control group of tortoises back on Earth.
Right, so they could compare the two.
Exactly. It was all part of what they called pathomorphological and histochemical experiments.
Sounds a bit grim.
Well, it was all in the name of science. But apart from the biological experiments, ZOND 5 also achieved something else quite significant.
What's that?
It took some really incredible photographs of the Earth. The first high-quality photographs taken from a distance of about 90,000 kilometers.
Wow.
I bet they were breathtaking.
I can imagine. So how did the world react to all this?
Well, back here on Earth, the reaction was pretty mixed, actually.
Okay.
Sir Bernard Lovell, the famous British astronomer, he came out and said that ZOND 5 proved the Soviets were winning the space race.
Really?
Yes. He even reckoned they'd be sending cosmonauts around the moon pretty soon.
Wow. What did the Americans make of all this?
Well, predictably, perhaps, they were a bit more skeptical.
Right.
They pointed out that the spacecraft hadn't actually flown that close to the moon, and that the angle of re-entry was so steep it would have been far too dangerous for humans to cope with. And then there was the fact that it landed miles off target. They took all that as evidence that the mission wasn't quite the triumph the Soviets were making it out to be.
So I guess you could say there was a fair bit of rivalry going on there?
Just a smidgen.
So what did they learn from the tortoises? How had they been affected by their trip?
Well, it turns out that the spacefaring tortoises had lost about 10% of their body weight,
Okay.
whereas the ones back on Earth, they only lost about 5%.
Right. Anything else?
Yeah, the flight tortoises, they had higher levels of iron and glycogen in their livers, and their spleens had undergone some structural changes.
So it sounds like space travel had a pretty big impact on them.
You might think so. But the main conclusion that the scientists drew was that most of the changes they observed were actually down to starvation, because they'd gone without food and water for so long. The actual effects of spaceflight, well, they reckon those were pretty minimal.
So all that. And the main thing that happened to the tortoises was they got hungry.
More or less. But the Soviets did eventually announce that they'd sent live animals on ZOND 5. That came out in November 1968.
Right.
And they also made it clear that they saw ZOND as a stepping stone to a crewed lunar flight. And interestingly, they said that before the Americans launched Apollo 8.
Oh, really? So trying to get one over on them, perhaps.
Possibly. Now, there's one final thing we need to talk about, and it's quite an amusing story.
Oh, go on then. I like amusing stories.
It's about what's been called the cosmonaut communication hoax.
Intriguing. Tell me more.
Right, so on September 19th, when ZOND 5 was near the moon, several radio observatories around the world, including Jundrell Bank in England and, intriguingly, the CIA in America,
Right.
they all picked up what they thought were voice transmissions from Soviet cosmonauts, specifically Valery Bukovsky, Vitaly Sevastyanov, and Pavel Popovich.
Oh, right.
And they thought these transmissions included telemetry readings and even discussions about a landing attempt.
So they thought the Soviets were trying to land on the moon.
They did. And you can imagine the reaction in the U.S. particularly. They thought the Soviets were about to beat them to a crude lunar landing.
That must have caused some panic.
I'm sure it did. But as it turned out, the whole thing was a bit of an elaborate prank.
A prank? Really?
Yes. Pavel Popovich, one of the cosmonauts whose voice was supposedly intercepted, well, he later admitted that they'd set the whole thing up.
So how did they do it?
Well, it seems they'd connected a receiver to the transmitter on board ZOND 5, and then when the spacecraft was near the moon, Popovich, who was back in mission control, he pretended to be a cosmonaut reporting from the lunar surface.
You're kidding. They were just messing about.
It seems so. Popovich called it hooliganism, I think.
Hooliganism, right? Well, I bet they had a good laugh about it. Did anyone else find it quite so funny?
Well, it caused quite a stir at the time. Popovich said President Johnson even got on the phone to Frank Borman, the American astronaut, to ask about it. Although Popovich later said he thought it was actually President Nixon.
Right.
But anyway, whoever it was, I suspect they weren't too amused.
Probably not. But Borman, I believe he was pretty good-humored about it, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. He and Popovich had a good chuckle about it later on, so all's well that ends well.
Indeed. So where is ZOND 5 now? What happened to it after all of that?
Well, it's ended up in a museum, hasn't it?
Oh, right.
The RKK Energia Museum in Moscow Oblast in Russia. It's quite a remarkable artifact from the early days of space exploration.
So it is. So I think it's fair to say that ZOND 5 was a real trailblazer. First spacecraft to go around the moon and back. First living creatures to be sent that far into space.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, the tortoises ended up a bit peckish, but it was all in the name of science, as you say.
Absolutely. And we've got to remember the context of all this as
Yeah.
well. The Cold War was in full swing. The space race was incredibly intense. And both the Soviets and the Americans were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And you can see that in everything about ZOND 5.
Oh, completely. I mean, they originally wanted to send humans, didn't they?
They did.
But those early failures, those must have been a real wake-up call.
Yes. The fear of failure, the potential for bad publicity was a huge factor in their decision-making.
Right. So, in a way, ZOND 5 represents both the ambition and the anxieties of that whole era.
It really does. And I think that cosmonaut prank, well, that just adds another layer of complexity to the whole story, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does.
It makes you wonder how much of what we know about space exploration during that period was driven by genuine scientific curiosity, and how much of it was all about, well, politics and propaganda and one-upmanship. It makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. And I think it's a question worth asking about all sorts of things, not just space exploration. And anyway, that's probably a discussion for another day. Indeed. But if all this has whetted your appetite, well, there's a whole lot more out there about the ZOND program in the early days of lunar exploration. So go and explore. And who knows, you might even unearth a few more of those hidden stories.
Happy digging.